জানো আমি শুক্রবার কে বাজালো এটা? কে বাজালো? বা এটা ভালো শিখে আছে যদিও বাজে তো একবার মাথায় ঢুকতে হবে, মগজ একবার खण्डन भव बन्धन जगद्बन्दन वन्दे निरञ्जनं नररूपधर निरञ्जनं नररूपधर निर्गुणं मोचन अघदूषण जगदूषण चिद्घन काय ज्ञानञ्जनं विमलनयन ज्ञानञ्जनं विमलनयन विखने भास्कर भाव सागर चिर उन्माद प्रेम बाधार भक्तार जानम युगल चारण भक्तार जानम युगल चारण तारण भव पार श्रीं भेद युग ईशार जगदीशार योग सहाय निरुद्धानं समाहित मन निरुद्धानं समाहित मन निराखि तव कृपा भाञ्जन दुःख गाञ्जन करुणाघन कर्म कठोर प्राणार्पणं जगत तारण प्राणार्पणं जगत तारण कृन्तन कलितो वाञ्छन সার হে নার বার দেহ পাদে অনুরাগ নির্ভয় গাত সংশয় দৃঢ় নিশ্চয় মানসবান নিষ্কাম রানম ভগত শরণ নিষ্কাম রানম ভগত শরণ তজে জাতি কুল সম্পদ তব শ্রীপাদ ভাব পুষ্পদ বারি যথা প্রেমার পান সমদার শান প্রেমার পান সমদার শান জগ জন দুঃখ সম্পদ তব শ্রীপদ ভাব গোষ্পদ বারিয়থা প্রেমার্পণ সমদর্শন প্রেমার্পণ সমদর্শন জগ জন দুঃখ যায় নমো নমো প্রভু ভাগ্যমনাদিত নমো নমো প্রভু ভাগ্যমনাদিত মন বচনৈকা ধার প্রভু মন বচনৈকা ধার জ্যোতির জ্যোতি উজ্জ্বল হৃদয় কন্দর জ্যোতির জ্যোতি উজ্জ্বল হৃদয় কন্দর তুমি তম ভঞ্জন হার প্রভু তুমি তম ভঞ্জন হার নমো নমো প্রভু ভাগ্যমনাদিত নমো নমো প্রভু ভাগ্যমনাদিত মন বচনৈকা ধার প্রভু মন বচনৈকা ধার জ্যোতির জ্যোতি উজ্জ্বল হৃদয় কন্দর জ্যোতির জ্যোতি উজ্জ্বল হৃদয় কন্দর তুমি তম ভঞ্জন হার প্রভু তুমি তম ভঞ্জন হার ধে লঙ্গ রঙ্গ ভঙ্গ বাজে অঙ্গ সঙ্গ মৃদঙ্গ ধে লঙ্গ রঙ্গ ভঙ্গ বাজে অঙ্গ সঙ্গ মৃদঙ্গ গাইছে ছন্দ ভগত বৃন্দ আরতি তোমার গাইছে ছন্দ ভগত বৃন্দ আরতি তোমার জয় জয় আরতি তোমার হর হর আরতি তোমার শিব শিব আরতি তোমার খান্ডন ভাব বন্ধন যার বন্দন বন্দে তোমায় জয় শ্রী गुरु महाराज जी की जय। ॐ ह्रीं ऋतं त्वमचलो गुणजित् गुणेभ्यः नाक्तं दिवां सकरुणं तव पादपद्मं मोहं कषं बहुकृतं न भजे यतोऽहं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो। भक्तिर्भगश्च भजनं भवभेदकारी गच्छन्तयलं सुविपुलं गमनाय तत्त्वं वक्त्रोद्धृतोऽपि हृदये न मे भाति किञ्चित् तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो। तेजस्तरन्ति तरसां त्वयि तृप्ततृष्णां रागे कृते ऋतपथे त्वयि रामकृष्णे मर्त्यामृतं तव पदं मरणोर्मि नाशं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो। कृत्यं करोति कलुषं कुहकान्तकारीं शान्तं शिवं सुविमलं तव नाम नाथ यस्मादहं तु अशरणं जगदेकगम्यं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो। ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतार वरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ सर्वमङ्गल माङ्गल्ये शिवे सर्वार्थसाधिके शरण्ये त्र्यम्बके गौरी स्थिते विनाशानां शक्तिये भूते सनातने गुणाश्रये गुणमये नारायणी नमोस्तुते शरणागतं दीनार्तं परित्राण परायणे सर्वस्यार्ते हरे देवी नारायणी नमोस्तुते जय नारायणी नमोस्तुते जय नारायणी नमोस्तुते जय नारायणी नमोस्तुते जय नारायणी नमोस्तुते। जय महामाई की जय, जय भगवान श्री रामकृष्ण देव की जय, जय स्वामी जी महाराज जी की जय।
Hello, check. Hello, check. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, check. Okay. Namaste Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukhaswarupaya Swamine Tapaharine. So today, the next example that Vivekananda gives here in trying to illustrate this notion of Maya and the contradictions that comprise our life is an ethical one. Essentially, the conflicts that the notion of ethics as a human concept bring in our lives. And the specific aspect of this that he is trying to draw is how this notion of good, bad, just, unjust, etc., these values, these dual pairs of values that guide our lives, how that throws up very intense contradictions when we try to relate it to, say, the notion of evolution or something that is an objective fact. This contradiction between our psychological values and the scientific fact of evolution is something that he is going to show up. He is going to explore here in this one paragraph. We'll come back to this particular issue later, but I think this is a certain fundamental point, and unless we understand it, it's very difficult to grasp what exactly Vivekananda means when he says that Maya is a statement of fact. Yeah? So let's start. Again, we often hear that it is one of the features of evolution that it eliminates evil, and this evil, being continually eliminated from the world, at last only good will remain. This is a very naive kind of point of view that he's sort of raising, but at some level, at some irrational or irrational level, this is the kind of thing that we all like to subscribe to. Yeah? And we basically start thinking of our individual values as some kind of absolute thing. And when some bunch of questions challenges that set of values, what we regard as good, somebody else does not regard as good. What we regard as bad, somebody else does not regard as bad, maybe regards it as the opposite. Then our set of values become challenged. And this notion of good and bad, how very, very anthropomorphic, how very, very merely human it is exposed, in particular the bunch of values on which we base our lives. When we are forced to examine them by the set of circumstances, we typically go one of two ways. Either we become irrational fanatics, where we do not like to examine what we believe, but without sufficient reason. Either that, or that set of values that we subscribe to just breaks apart and we become cynics. Both these reactions are born out of insecurity. Insecurity of not basing our set of values on some clear, rational convictions. Because then there is no question of conflict, yeah? So this is a point of view that many of us do subscribe to, and it's essentially this idea that the evolution is going to eliminate evil. This is something that's a very naive point of view. I mean, here is the basic thing. Why should this be regarded as why should today, after the end of the 20th century, at the early part of the 21st century, why should we regard this point of view, this conflating or confusion between human values, human ethics, and the scientific fact of evolution, and the confusion between the two, and basically trying to guide this scientific evolution or the evolution of species? Why should that basically some kind of moralists trying to say that no, this biological evolution is the same as some kind of ethical evolution. Why should that be regarded as a very naive point of view, an unexamined point of view? We'll come back to this question, but I think we should put this there so that at least for the time being, you can think about this issue. Does biological evolution of species, does that have anything to do at all with this notion of ethics, notion of good, bad, etc., with which we guide our lives on a day-to-day basis in a society? Do these things have anything at all to do with each other? If yes, what? And if not, why not? Okay? So these are basically issues that we can try to examine and get at a better understanding of what exactly ethics means, what exactly the evolution of species in terms of biology means, and what is the domain of one, what is the domain of the other. Where does confusing the two lead to some complete lack of clarity in our understanding? What will happen if we ask these questions and shine this rational light of enquiry on these issues? Our own understanding will become clearer and deeper, and our level of judgmentality and jumping to a conclusion because of some emotional drive or impulse, this is going to cease. In other words, the mind is going to become clearer and more rational. That's, I think, the point of these kinds of analysis. Okay. So what is Vivekananda's response? You have to think and come up with your own response to it. I'll have to think about it and come up with my own response to these issues. Here is Vivekananda's response. Yeah. That is very nice to hear. What is very nice to hear? That at last only good will remain and what we call evil is going to be eliminated. That is very nice to hear. And then he says, and it panders to the vanity of those who have enough of this world's goods, who have not a hard struggle to face every day and are not being crushed under the wheel of this so-called evolution. It is very good and comforting indeed to such fortunate ones. The common herd may suffer, but they do not care. Let them die, they are of no consequence. Very good. Yet this argument is fallacious from beginning to end. It takes for granted, in the first place, so which argument is fallacious? The idea that with evolution, what we call evil is going to be eliminated and good alone will survive, that is rubbish. That's what he is saying in slightly, in pretty forceful language, but not maybe in such one or two words. He's going to explain that. Why is this argument fallacious in Vivekananda's point of view? It takes for granted in the first place that manifested good and evil in this world are two absolute realities. This is what we were trying to say when we were saying at the beginning that there is an absolute good, there's an absolute bad, and one is going to decrease, the other is going to increase. This, he's saying, is a completely fallacious notion, a wrong notion. What about the next? In the second place, it makes a still worse assumption that the amount of good is an increasing quantity and the amount of evil is a decreasing quantity. So if evil is being eliminated in this way by what they call evolution, there will come a time when all this evil will be eliminated and what remains will be all good. Very easy to say. But can it be proved that evil is a lessening quantity? So this other thing, that good is going to go on. I mean, this is really the very dualistic sort of idea of, after one dies, one goes to a heaven where there is all good and no evil. This is the naive idea that we sort of hope for. This is wishful thinking without sort of facing facts. That's the position that is being challenged. Yeah? Take, for instance, so very easy to say, but can it be proved that evil is a lessening quantity? Take, for instance, the man who lives in a forest, who does not know how to cultivate the mind, cannot read a book, has not heard of such a thing as writing. If he is severely wounded, he is soon all right again. While we die, if we get a scratch. Machines are making things cheap, making for progress and evolution. But millions are crushed that one may become rich. While one becomes rich, thousands at the same time become poorer and poorer, and whole masses of human beings are made slaves. That way it is going on. So this is basically what is evolution being equated with here, and this is really what I'll come back to. Here essentially evolution is being equated with development of culture, sensitivity, knowledge, all our higher human pursuits. Okay? Not the evolution of a species, not the biological evolution. Is it good? Is it bad? And I think what is being pointed out here is that these questions are meaningless questions in this context. And it comes back to it. The animal man lives in the senses. If he does not get enough to eat, he is miserable. Or if something happens to his body, he is miserable. In the senses, both his misery and his happiness begin and end. In other words, the seeking of joy and avoiding of pain for the person who lives in the forests, say hunts animals, gathers roots and berries and eats them, and that's all. Eating, sleeping, and propagation of species. This is how biological evolution occurs. An elephant does not go and watch, the huge animal, but it does not go and watch a a classical music program and enjoy it. Yeah? Nor does it undergo the kind of pain that many human beings undergo when they see other people suffer, for instance. These sensitivities are born out of a certain kind of social life in which we live. Connecting these two pieces, the evolution of society and biological evolution, is a confusion that we need to avoid. And many of these contradictions, and this is exactly what I have been hinting at, I've said this twice, this is what I'll come back to. What is it in us? We were discussing this towards the end of the last class when, unfortunately, the internet sort of broke down. That really the cause of this contradiction lies in our constitutional makeup, in our biological makeup. Two aspects of our thought. Mentioned this last time. I hope to come back to this particular point of where this contradiction originates and how we can address it. But for that, we will have to analyze our subjective system as if it's something that we study and put on a table and arrange in front of us so that we can analyze it objectively from an observer's perspective. This is the issue that we would like to come back to. For the time being, we will complete Vivekananda's analysis of this. So what he is saying right now is that this notion of evil or pain, for a person who lives entirely in the senses, it starts and ends with the body. Okay? As soon as this man, this primitive man, progresses, as soon as his horizon of happiness increases, his horizon of unhappiness increases proportionately. This is the fundamental point that he is going to try to make. You cannot accept one side of the coin and avoid the other. If there is a seeking of happiness, it is going to bring with it the shadow of unhappiness. In other words, this running after happiness and blinding oneself or closing one's eyes to unhappiness is a lopsided and immature view of the way things function, is the point that he is trying to make. The man in the forest does not know what it is to be jealous, to be in the law courts, to pay taxes, to be blamed by society, to be ruled over day and night by the most tremendous tyranny that human diabolism ever invented, which pries into the secrets of every human heart. He does not know how man becomes 1,000 times more diabolical than any other animal, with all his vain knowledge and with all his pride. Thus it is that as we emerge out of the senses, we develop higher powers of enjoyment, and at the same time, we have to develop higher powers of suffering too. In the next sentence, he is going to hint at even the physical basis of it. The nerves become finer. In order to enjoy or to have some higher kind of joy, the nerves are tuned to some, so they become finer, more refined. The nerves become finer, and then what he says is, and capable of more suffering. So the capacity to perceive joy, higher joys, bring with it the capacity to suffer, to undergo pain. The two go together. One cannot be perceived, enjoyed in isolation and avoiding its opposite. That's what he is saying here. In every society, we often find that the ignorant common man, when abused, does not feel much, but he feels a good thrashing. But the gentleman cannot bear a single word of abuse. He has become so finely nerved. Misery has increased with his susceptibility to happiness. In other words, this refinement of the nerves has increased our susceptibility to happiness, capacity to be happy, but that has simultaneously increased our capacity to be unhappy. This does not go much to prove the so-called evolutionists' cause. As we increase our power to be happy, we also increase our power to suffer. And sometimes I'm inclined to think that if we increase our power to become happy in arithmetical progression, we shall increase, on the other hand, our power to become miserable in geometrical progression. We who are progressing know that the more we progress, the more avenues are opened to pain as well as to pleasure. And this is Maya. This ethical conflict. So today, this whole theme has been about ethical conflicts, about what is good and what is bad, and how something, if we call this capacity to have greater joy evolution, then it brings with itself simultaneously the capacity to suffer equally. Yeah? And he'll say again, reiterate the stand, that thus we find that Maya is not a theory or the explanation of the world. It is simply a statement of facts as they exist, that the very basis of our being is contradiction. All right. So now I think the time has come. I've said it twice or thrice, that this is a certain point that we would like to dwell on for a while. Constitutionally, in our existence, where does this contradiction come from? And I don't think, and here is the point, I don't think this explanation can be obtained from philosophy. It is not something that can be done by sort of just pure thought. There are facts that have led to this contradiction. What is that? And really, I think, today with advancement of scientific knowledge, there are two things we need to register. One, evolution of species. So life begins on Earth some several million years back, several billion years back, in the form of unicellular organisms. And then they combine together, form more complex objects. In this kind of evolutionary time scale, how old is human settlement, human civilization as we know it today. How far back does this go? 5,000 years? No more. Well, if a person lives, I said this last time, for rounding off, let's say a person lives 100 years. How old is civilization? 50 generations. How old is this universe according to the present scientific understanding? 12 billion years. There is an enormous difference between the lifespan of the universe and the lifespan of an individual human being. Even conceiving of the history of the human race seems beyond our conception. On the other hand, we would like these billion years of evolution to subscribe to these petty values that we as individuals, we as a species subscribe to. Now that does sound absurd when you state it that way. It is as if one is saying that, look, I am sitting here and I am feeling thirsty, and therefore clouds should sort of assemble in the skies, pour rain so that I can drink that water. I don't think the clouds could be bothered, really. Why? Because essentially it is trying to look at things from a very, very narrow, very anthropomorphic, a very selfish, petty perspective. Instead of expanding our perspective to look at nature, at this world around us from its own point of view. In other words, to decondition our minds from its likes and dislikes to ascertain truth, factual information, we would much rather that the world modifies itself and suits itself to our needs. This is the basis of this contradiction. How? See, if you look at the way sort of children, say a single-celled zygote evolves into this human being in the mother's womb and then slowly evolves over time, you'll see that this entire evolution of species, it's something that we read when we were in school, ontogeny repeats phylogeny. Basically, the evolution of the species is mapped in a way to the way the individual fetus, the human fetus, develops. And what happens is that it is actually going through various changes and taking paths which evolution has dictated to be advantageous. How many years has it taken to do that? Millions. And we are saying that this society, human beings for several tens of thousands of years. By human beings, I don't mean human beings settled in a place. I mean the species, Homo sapiens. They lived as hunter-gatherers, just like other animals. Moving from, earlier, if one goes back further, one will basically go back along the evolutionary chain to what are called primates. So our cousins in the evolutionary ladder, our nearest cousins as a species are the chimpanzees. We diverged from them, say maybe about 10 million years back or so. Yeah? And then on one side, one of those paths started evolving and became we are, as human beings, we are bipedal, which means that we walk on 2 feet. Most animals walk on 4. Now, this was an evolutionary advantage for some reasons. And then we basically managed to develop the capacity to build instruments. And today, this is the real reason why we are here in the world and animals are kept in zoos and we go from outside and watch them. What has led to that? What has led to essentially human beings as a species basically overruling the planet? And the answer to that, again, is really this front part of our brain and its functions. As I mentioned last time, that the prefrontal cortex, the region behind this, the forehead, comprises almost half our brain weight, whereas in our nearest relative, the chimpanzee, that occupies just about 1/10, 9%. What are the capacities for this? One, it succeeds in mapping the rest of the world into our head and thinking of that, and develops a capacity to think of that as one unified whole. This biological capacity is at the basis of human beings thinking A in terms of families, B in terms of neighborhoods, C in terms of tribes. Then today tribes have evolved into nations. So one can think of a nation. Where is the country? The country is in our heads. It's something that we have mapped, and we have become emotionally and intellectually invested in it. If one is taken, I think I had mentioned this story several times, and it's there that it really struck me with its full force, that how this is just a story in our heads. And we don't see through it. We can't rationally cut through it because these are stories that we adore. Yeah? If you're taken to a place in the middle of a field, say blindfolded and left there, would you be able to know which country you're in by just looking around? Is there a line in that field saying, look, here country A ends and there country B begins? Nobody knows. So these things are stories, and these stories have given rise to the politics that human beings indulge in, and so on. Now this capacity to build stories and share them is again something born out of this capacity to map the rest of the world into oneself and think of some things or some people as one's own. Where is it? It's in the head. It's in our thoughts. It's in our feelings. So what part of the evolution are we talking about here? It is the social evolution alone. On the other hand, when we look at biological evolution, species evolve only to sustain themselves. Hence our so-called lower instincts, fight, flight, fear, anger, hatred, passions. These are where necessary for the propagation of a species. If you are walking along a dense forest and you hear a dangerous animal, if you immediately don't get into this panic mode of running away, then chances are very high that you will end up as a meal for some wild animal. So the propagation of the species requires human beings to subscribe to these what we call baser passions, these instincts of fight, flight, etc., etc. On the other hand, where are these? As I said, these are really located in our hindbrain. Yeah? The part of the brain that has evolved for long, but it's more primitive. The more evolved parts, which are this forebrain, these give rise to higher human activities, in particular to analytical thinking and a capacity to think of a larger number of human beings and their causes as one's own. This larger, more abstract thinking is something that distinguishes us from other animals. And these two capacities are not the same. One basically says sustain the material basis of existence alone. And this other part is essentially saying that, look, in social evolution, sure, the biology has not caught up. The biological evolution cannot catch up. It's over 1,000,000 years, more than that. It certainly cannot catch up with the social evolution, which has taken only 5,000 years or 10,000 years. This conflict between how we have, as a species, how we have constructed our societies and biological aspects which go towards sustenance or maintenance of individual members of the species, these two kinds of evolution are in conflict with each other. One moving towards a larger, more abstract, more unified existence. The other more rigid, more material, guided by our fear, passions, which were necessary for the propagation and sustenance of the species. The values, therefore, is our societal way of saying that this material evolution should progress towards values, which is rubbish. In other words, the two aspects, this conflict in values is really within our system itself. One part of the system going towards physical sustenance, the other, the forebrain, going towards a more non-material, larger sustenance. If you understand these things in these clear scientific terms, then it's not that the contradictions will vanish. What will happen is that so long as we live in societies, A, and B, so long as we accept that we actually are not so different from animals, we are animals, really, our genetic code and the genetic code of a monkey are not so different. When we understand this, then we'll basically lose this vanity as a species, A, and B, recognize the fact that this evolution in our brains is responsible for our ethics, and biological evolution has no need to pay even a token obeisance to these values that we have come up with. In the takeaway, what is the sort of one-line summary? Social evolution gives rise to values. Biological evolution gives rise to sustenance of a species, of an individual member of the species. In themselves, there is neither good nor bad about either of them. The conflict arises when you try to explain one in terms of the other, or you try to put these two together in one system and try to understand it without understanding the fact that aspects of our own being draw, on the one hand, from this material existence, on the other, from this more abstract, unified existence. One gives rise to sustenance of the body, the other gives rise to values. Okay? If one understands it this way, then the contradictions are not going to melt away, but they get a natural backdrop to sit inside. We'll start from here next time. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.